Again, I'm not sure about if those recommendations were strong, because I believe every one of us could have made those recommendations even before commission. Because you've seen the rifles that police were holding. One could have gone to say, why police are holding these rifles within community? That's what, because that's what it's one of the recommendations. And other recommendations also, because I believe most of those recommendations everyone could have made. If you look at those people were fighting for a living wage.
Yeah.
And if you look at it, everyone could have said social contract of employment must be reviewed, even before the commission could. So I'm not sure if those recommendations were very strong, as you have said. Thank you.
Thank you. The last
Thanks.
question.
My name's Alan Fine. Thanks, Kelly, for the good presentation. Because of the kind of work I do, I took a look at the report. I read the report on the basis of trying to work out what lessons it holds for companies, implicitly or explicitly. And I think there are quite a lot of useful things there, some of which you mentioned. But for one thing, it also found that among the roots of the conflict lay in the way the companies through that year had handled interactions, particularly with the rock pool operators, starting with Impala Platinum in January. And that actually makes the case for a more centralized form of bargaining in sectors. I should tell Jane I said that. We've had some interactions. It tells companies you've got to think very, very carefully before you refuse to talk to striking workers or other people that might be in conflict with you, like communities, by the way, just by questioning their legitimacy on the grounds perhaps that the strike is unprotected. You can't just refuse to talk. You can't have a strict majoritarian approach to labour relations on security for companies. There's an institution called the Voluntary Principles on Security and Human Rights that a lot of companies have used effectively. It requires companies for their own security staff to make sure they've had human rights training. It requires them to make sure that any private company, security company they take on, has provided human rights training. It actually requires a company, when it calls in the police, to talk to the police about the methods they're going to use in situations of conflict. You can't just rely on them. And then finally...
Would you please raise your voice, please?
Yeah, and then finally, related to what it said about Cyril Ramaphosa and other board members, it raises all sorts of obligations on boards of companies to take notice of all of these kinds of issues and not just to management. They have to oversee these things. Yeah.
Thank you. Carl, you can start with any of the largely comments and questions raised.
Well, Alan, I'll take those as comments, and I think they're extremely valuable observations that can be taken forward by managements.
Can you all hear her?
Yeah.
Okay.
The comrade around the corner. I mean, you made a whole range of points. And one of the things I think you were raising is that there's a whole history around commissions. And that, you know, I think this whole thing around our past and around our history is actually really important. I mean, there's some people who say that the TRC, because a whole lot of issues weren't resolved at the TRC, they're simply bubbling back at us again. You know, the whole issue of, you know, compensation and so on, that has not gone away, and we just haven't resolved those issues. And we find, you know, deep into our democracy, years later, the same issues are still being raised because we don't ever resolve them. And I think that is one, it sort of speaks to that point that I made about the sort of legalism of a commission of inquiry, that it doesn't look, there are different kinds of knowledge, there are different kinds of perspectives. One is a legal perspective that tries empirically to establish the facts and the truth of the matter. But then you have the sociologist, historian, and so on, who have a very different perspective of why these things happen. And very often in these commissions, that perspective is not, kept in place. So, for example, a lawyer gave me an interesting example. He said that he had worked on the Uppington case, which was an apartheid common purpose trial in Uppington. And he said there was a witness who said, what you lawyers don't take into account is that the magistrate and the police drink at night in the same pub. And so, you've got to see that there's collusion. And this lawyer thought, what's that got to do with this, that he can't prove that, it's just hearsay. But he said that is the historical approach. Yes, they probably were drinking in the same pub, given what apartheid was. And that, in fact, to get a really meaningful kind of dialogue coming out of a commission, you need to look at that historical as well as the kind of legal fact-finding thing. That was one issue you raised. I think we just have to say commissions have very severe limitations. And it's really up to us to decide whether commissions have any use at all. I think they have some use, but some people may feel, well, there are other ways of finding the truth that might have been much more effective than a commission. I haven't heard anybody put forward any ideas about what would be more effective. A lot of people criticize commissions, but I have heard a case made for a civilian commission of inquiry. And I think that could be a very useful experiment. And I think, that it has some downsides because you don't have the same sort of power of seizure and subpoena and so on. You don't have that legal background. You don't have that kind of weight. But I think to have experts actually running a commission who actually know about labor issues, who know about policing, actually could have been extremely useful in when witnesses were in the dark. Sorry, to the person right at the back, I didn't catch your name, but you were saying what was the point of all these recommendations? We knew all this stuff before anyway. Look, I think that's very true, that a lot of it we did know before. The fact is that the society weren't listening to them. And it's one of these tragic things that you have to have a massive event for the society to sit up and say, we actually got to look at migrant labour, we've got to look at the indebtedness of workers, we've got to look at the fact that services aren't provided in mining towns, we've got to look at the fact that the municipalities are not working properly, we've got to look at the fact that the traditional authorities haven't released land so that there can be land development. Suddenly all these issues can be scrutinized. They've come to the surface. And I think whatever one says, and you could see it with South Africans, everybody was waiting for the Commission's hearings, the Commission's results, the Commission's recommendations. Commissions do hold weight. And so if you want to take up these issues, if you can take the recommendations from the Commission, you have a whole lot more weight to your campaign, your argument in court or whatever. So I do agree with you, and I think, as I said earlier, one of the great misfortunes was we knew a lot of that, particularly around policing. These ideas have been around for a long time, the recommendations that are in the Commission. But I think something really new might have come out of phase 2. It would have investigated the things that I've just spoken about, the role of the traditional authorities, the role of the municipalities, the role of the national credit regulator. It would have looked at all of those things, and something new, and hopefully new recommendations would have come out of that. But unfortunately, that is not the way that the Commission went.
I'll give 1, 2, 3, and the 4th one of the governor back. I'll start with you, ma'am.
I'm Justine Limpidlaw, and I'm a media lawyer with no experience at all about Marikana. But it's a question, not a comment. I found your comment that Cyril Ramaphosa was calling for the strike to be shut down because of its political implications in terms of EFF, ANC politics, really fascinating. It's not an analysis I've heard before. I thought that it was really focused on it was bad for London from a business point of view. And I just wondered if that was explored at all, how much that was explored, and to what extent this really is about a political fight as opposed to an economic fight.
Okay. The second question? Sir.
Yeah. You spoke about how
Your name, please, sir?
You spoke about how the Commission exploded the myth of inter-union rivalry. But were there any insights on the role the unions themselves might have played in allowing this kind of virulent atmosphere to fester? You know, I mean, I know very little, but there's kind of like rumblings of the fact that the relationship between Labour and the bosses had basically taken shop stewards off the floor and put them in comfy offices. I mean, I may be speaking nonsense, but does it have any insights about the unions themselves?
Yeah, the next question? Yes, sir.
Stephen Faulkner from the 9+ unions, which should give everybody a great I think a couple of quick questions. I mean, first of all, Carl, first, thank you for your presentation. Not an easy thing to do by any means. But the first thing is, you know, what's the possibility, for example, in future, of making sure that the terms of reference of a commission are not confined to the hallowed boardrooms and are more subject to public panel beating? That seems to me to be critical. Because one of the lessons that's emerged from Ireland and from Spain around the massacres under the Franco regime, and of course Ireland's appalling record of absence of human rights, etc., is that 25 years later, often, the terms of reference are then challenged. And it just seems to me that, you know, we've got to unpack that whole process of terms of reference being subjected to public scrutiny and alteration, etc. The second thing is, what's really depressing about the report is, on the one hand, there is all this very rich information and evidence and so on, but right at the end it falls back into a very sort of serial chain of events analysis. So you end up with, quite frankly, the ludicrous statements that an unprotected strike actually led to this terrible thing that's happened at the end. And if that strike had been properly organised and, you know, legal in the sense of the LRA, etc., then another outcome may have happened. Well, it may or may not, but surely that's not the approach. It shouldn't be an approach about a serial chain of events. It should be more holistic, which is what the Commission promised, and then in its recommendations chronically failed. And then just a quick last point is that one of the things which I think has emerged from particularly Spain and Ireland, and you referred to Ireland, is that while the inquiries were going on, what was really instructive about the Irish and particularly the Spanish situation is that there were parallel people's inquiries. And I think that they helped to keep the public awareness much more alive, rather than relying upon a report which is delayed for a year and then delayed further while in further investigation goes, and then delayed by the presidency, allows all sorts of other factors to sort of influence people's perception of it. So, you know, I think the whole question of parallel people's inquiries to reinforce and give a voice to those who are not being properly heard is perhaps something that we should think about in future.
Thank you. Gavin?
So Gavin Katz from Swap. Well, first of all, I completely support your points, Steve, from 9+. Mine, Kelly, you've had a very difficult job today, because obviously summarising this massive process of the Commission and its findings is an enormous job, and quite sensibly you've sort of followed the track of the process of how a Commission should work, how this one did work, and what the findings were, and the strengths and weaknesses of it. But like Steve, I want to broaden the conversation a little bit. This isn't a critique, but it's to broaden it, which is, of course, to remind ourselves that this Commission actually happened within a social field, and the social field of absolutely massive conflict. On the one hand, an explosion of class struggle which hasn't been seen in South Africa for years, which ruptured much of the post-94 settlement, which ruptured most of the labour relations framework, and on the other, massive repression by the state. That's the actual field within which this commission was happening, because it wasn't as if it all ended with the Marikana massacre on the 16th. The strikes and the struggle and everything else was ongoing at the time that the commission was ongoing. And that obviously bled into and affected the way that the commission went about its business. So 3 points are coming from that. First of all, one of the confused and ill-defined purposes of the commission, and perhaps one of the lost opportunities which you haven't mentioned, is its potential role as a reconciliation and healing process. That was put on the table. And the failure of that is demonstrated in the failure of the treatment of the widows of the slain mine workers, who from the get-go were absolutely treated with contempt. And they were treated with contempt, not just in the sense of the way that the commission worked, but I would say also by Farland himself. And it took a real struggle at the beginning of the commission by them, by the Marikana Support Campaign and others, to force them actually into the field of the commission and at least to have some kind of presence. And the way in which they found out the results at the end was quite frankly disgusting. So that's one part of it. A second part of it is witness intimidation. Let's not forget, when the commission started and was going on, key witnesses, mine workers who were going to be called, weren't just facing police charges for the murder of their colleagues, but them and community members who also could have been called up were being systematically harassed and imprisoned and beaten all the way through. Farland did absolutely nothing to address that. That is huge witness intimidation. And this comes to my final point really, which is about Farland himself. It may very well be true that he did not explicitly align himself with the powers that be in, say, the style of Widgery in the Bloody Sunday inquiry. But nevertheless, the fact remains that Farland is and was a Conservative judge, and a judge who came to this process as a social actor with his own ideological inclinations. And I think that really did play out in much of the way in which the Commission worked, and it didn't work, and indeed in his findings, and the way in which he conceived the role of the mine workers and what they were doing and why they were doing it.
Thank you. Jackie, I'll give you the next round, please. Would you like to comment?
I'd like to support Steve's point about parallel people's inquiries. And I want to refer to a particular example of that which happened last month, which was a People's Tribunal against hunger, food prices and landlessness. And what was so incredibly impressive about it is the combination of experiential evidence from people living with hunger, and that's 53% of our population, and then people coming in and giving expert evidence about why food prices are rising. And I think it's that combination of mixing experiential and, if you like, expert evidence, the voices of different categories of people, make me think that we should be having another seminar which addresses precisely this question of what social formations do we need, given what seems to me like an expensive failure. This is what we need to be investigating.
Okay. Thanks for that. I'll give Carly time to...
Divide, that you had thought that it was an economic decision. Of course, Ramaphosa spans the whole lot. He's compromised on every level. He's a non-executive board member of Lonmin. He is on the national executive of the ANC. He wasn't a minister at that time, but he certainly was angling in that direction. So he actually had all sorts of considerations. And the one was obviously the political consideration. He had, of course, also been chair of the board that had disciplined Malema. And so he had his own sort of axe to grind on that score. He definitely wanted that strike to end for economic reasons. He wanted people to get back to work and for things to go on as usual. I think that he was disingenuous in that he just described the strikers as criminals. This is criminal activity and we have to end the strike. Because I do think, and it's very uneven in the Farland Commission and in the report, but Farnham does at times try to say this is not one group working, the strikers are not just one common purpose group. They're not all going, you have to differentiate, they're people doing different things. Most people are not criminals. Most people are not going to kill scabs. Maybe one or two did. But in this case, people were actually on strike because they were earning the lowest wages on the Platinum Belt, or the big three. So there was Amplats, Implats, and as I think Steve pointed out, there'd been an Implats strike earlier in the year where wages had gone up, and London was lagging behind, so they had a very genuine grievance. And that's what drove, I think, most of the strikers. But Ramaphosa framed it that these are all criminals and we simply have to stop this. And he knows that's not the case because he knows how strikers operate. So I think, there were a whole range of different things happening at the same time, different interests happening for him. Let me just see. There wasn't a great deal of discussion around the unions. Basically, the Commission ruled that it wasn't inter-union violence that had led to all of the violence. Maybe there was, in the early stages, one or two instances with scab labour. But it didn't. It ruled out that possibility very early, that the unions were to blame. It did say that, AMCU could have kept its membership more in control. They were singing provocative songs. It did say that the NUM had to be investigated for culpability of shooting the two workers that came to its offices. Its members came to the offices. They were told by management, you must go to NUM, you must sort this out, we're not going to talk to you because there's a 2-year agreement in place. And when they went, the NUM guys just panicked and shot 2 of the mine workers. Didn't kill them, but actually shot them. So